The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Norfolk as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stepped out of a rental car. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing civilian clothes that made her blend in with any college student. She had deliberately chosen to arrive early and in plain clothes, wanting to observe the base operations before making her official entrance as the new Admiral. Sarah had spent the last 10 years climbing the ranks faster than anyone in recent naval history. Her PhD in strategic military operations from Annapolis, combined with her exceptional leadership during 3 overseas deployments, had caught the attention of the Pentagon. At an age when most officers were just making lieutenant commander, Sarah had been selected for the youngest admiral appointment in the base's history. But looking at her now, standing in the parking lot with a small backpack and wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater, no one would guess her true identity. This was exactly what she had planned. The base was already buzzing with morning activity. Sailors moved with purpose across the grounds, their uniforms crisp and their bearing reflecting years of military training. Sarah watched them with keen interest, noting the dynamics, the informal hierarchies, and the general morale of the personnel. As she walked toward the main administrative building, she overheard conversations about the incoming new admiral. The previous admiral, James Morrison, had retired after 30 years of distinguished service, and everyone was curious about his replacement. "I heard the new admiral is some young hotshot from the Pentagon," said Petty Officer First Class Mike Rodriguez to his friend as they passed Sarah on the walkway. "Probably never seen real action." "Politics," replied Chief Petty Officer David Thompson, shaking his head. "That's all is these days. Probably some admiral's kid who got fast-tracked." Sarah smiled to herself, but said nothing. She had heard these assumptions throughout her career. Being young and Asian American in a field still dominated by older white men meant she constantly had to prove herself. But she had learned that actions spoke louder than words, and she preferred to let her work do the talking. She continued walking, taking mental notes of everything she observed. The base appeared well-maintained, but she noticed several areas that could benefit from improvement. Some of the junior sailors looked tired, suggesting possible issues with scheduling or workload distribution. She made mental notes to address these concerns once she officially took command. Near the entrance to the main building, she encountered her first real interaction with the base personnel. A group of 5 sailors were standing near the doors, clearly taking an unauthorized break. When they saw her approaching, their conversation stopped, and they began to snicker. "Excuse me, miss," called out Seaman James Patterson, a tall, lanky sailor with a cocky grin. "I think you might be lost. The civilian contractor entrance is around back." His friends laughed, and Sarah could see they were enjoying what they thought was harmless fun at the expense of someone they assumed didn't belong on their base. "Actually," Sarah replied calmly, "I'm exactly where I need to be." "Sure you are," said Petty Officer Second Class Lisa Morgan, rolling her eyes. "Let me guess, you're here for some kind of college internship program?" The group erupted in laughter again. Sarah noticed how they carried themselves with the casual arrogance that sometimes developed among personnel who had become too comfortable in their environment. This was exactly the kind of attitude that could become problematic if left unchecked. "Something like that," Sarah said with a slight smile, deciding to play along for now. She was curious to see how far they would take their assumptions. Seaman Patterson stepped forward, clearly the self-appointed leader of the group. "Well, intern girl, you should know that this is a military installation. We don't really have time to babysit civilians who don't know where they're going." "That's right," added Petty Officer Third Class Kevin Walsh, a stocky sailor with red hair. "This isn't some playground where you can just wander around taking pictures for your Instagram." The comment about Instagram particularly amused Sarah, since her social media presence consisted of exactly 0 posts. She had always maintained strict operational security, even in her personal life. "I appreciate the guidance," Sarah said diplomatically, "but I think I can find my way." "Look, sweetheart," Patterson continued, his tone becoming more condescending. "I've been stationed here for 3 years. I know this place inside and out. Why don't you tell me who you're supposed to meet, and I'll point you in the right direction. Save us all some time. The use of sweetheart was particularly telling. Sarah had dealt with this kind of casual sexism throughout her career, but it never failed to remind her why strong leadership was so important in military environments. This kind of behavior, if tolerated, could create serious problems for morale and unit cohesion. "I'm meeting with the base leadership," Sarah replied truthfully. This prompted even more laughter from the group. "Base leadership?" Morgan scoffed. "Right. And I'm meeting with the president later for lunch." "Maybe she's one of those military wives who thinks she outranks everyone because of her husband," suggested Walsh, earning appreciative chuckles from his companions. Sarah felt a familiar surge of frustration at the assumption that any woman on a military base must be there because of a man. It was exactly this kind of thinking that she had spent years working to change within the naval culture. "Actually," she said, her voice remaining calm despite her growing irritation, "I'm not married." "Oh, so you're just lost then," Patterson concluded with a grin. "Don't worry, happens to civilians all the time. Like I said, this isn't really a place for people who don't understand military protocol." The irony of receiving a lecture about military protocol from someone who was clearly violating it by taking an unauthorized break and harassing a visitor was not lost on Sarah. But she decided to continue observing rather than intervening immediately. "Tell you what," Patterson continued, clearly enjoying his perceived position of authority, "why don't you head back to your car and call whoever you're supposed to meet? They can come escort you to the right building. It's safer that way." "Safer?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "Well, security and all that," Walsh explained importantly. "We can't just have random people wandering around a military installation. There are protocols to follow." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. Here were 5 sailors violating protocol by congregating near the entrance during duty hours, lecturing her about the importance of following procedures. "Understand," she said. "Protocols are indeed very important." "Exactly," Patterson said, pleased that she seemed to be getting the message. "So why don't you run along and do this the right way?" The phrase "run along" was particularly grating, delivered as it was with the tone one might use with a troublesome child. Sarah made another mental note about the need for refresher training on professional conduct and
Today, we
respect
stand
for
together,
all personnel
ready to face
and
any challenge that
visitors.
comes our way.
"Before I go," Sarah said, her curiosity getting the better of her, "can I ask you something?" "Sure, ask away," Patterson replied magnanimously, clearly enjoying his role as the helpful local expert. "What do you think of your new admiral?" The question prompted an immediate exchange of glances among the group, and Sarah could see they were excited to share their opinions. "Haven't met him yet," Morgan said, "but from what we've heard, he's probably going to be another by-the-book type who doesn't understand what it's really like for the regular sailors." "That's the problem with these Pentagon appointments," Thompson chimed in. "They send us people who look good on paper, but don't have real experience with day-to-day operations. Plus, word is he's really young," Walsh added. "Probably got promoted too fast, and thinks he knows everything." Sarah found their assumptions fascinating, particularly since they had managed to get both her age and gender wrong, while still expressing skepticism about her qualifications. "What if the new admiral turned out to be different than you expected?" she asked. Patterson shrugged. "Doesn't really matter. Admirals come and go, but we're the ones who actually keep this place running. As long as he stays out of our way and lets us do our jobs, we'll be fine." The casual dismissal of command authority was troubling, but also informative. It suggested that the previous admiral's leadership style might have been more hands-off than optimal, allowing this kind of attitude to develop among some personnel. "Well," Sarah said, shouldering her backpack, "I guess I'll find out soon enough." "Good luck, intern girl," Patterson called after her as she walked toward the building entrance. "Try not to get too lost in there." The laughter followed her as she approached the main doors, but Sarah's mind was already focused on the challenges ahead. In less than an hour, she would be meeting with the base's senior staff for the first time. Many of them probably shared similar assumptions about her age and experience, though they would likely be more diplomatic in expressing them. As she reached for the door handle, Sarah reflected on the encounter she had just experienced. These 5 sailors weren't bad people, but they represented a cultural issue that needed addressing. Their casual disrespect for visitors, their unauthorized break time, and their dismissive attitude toward command authority were all symptoms of a larger problem. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. In just a few minutes, these same sailors who had been lecturing her about military protocol and suggesting she didn't belong on the base would discover that she was about to become the highest-ranking officer in their chain of command. But Sarah didn't take pleasure in the thought of their eventual embarrassment. Instead, she saw it as an opportunity to begin implementing the changes that would make Naval Base Norfolk a more professional, respectful, and effective military installation. As she stepped through the doors into the main building, she was already planning her approach. Leadership wasn't about humiliating subordinates or proving superiority. It was about creating an environment where everyone could perform at their best while maintaining the highest standards of military professionalism. The real work was about to begin, and Sarah Chun was ready for the challenge. Inside the main administrative building, Sarah was greeted by a much more professional atmosphere. The polished floors reflected the overhead lighting, and official naval photographs lined the walls, showing the base's proud history dating back to World War II. She approached the reception desk, where a young yeoman was working diligently at her computer. "Good morning," Sarah said pleasantly. "I'm here for the 9 o'clock meeting with Captain Williams." Yeoman Second Class Jennifer Martinez looked up and immediately noticed Sarah's civilian clothes and youthful appearance. Her expression showed mild confusion, but her response was professional. "Good morning, ma'am. May I have your name, please?" "Sarah Chun." Martinez checked her computer screen, and her eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Captain Williams is expecting you. Would you like me to escort you to the conference room?" Sarah noticed the yeoman's sudden change in demeanor after checking the computer, which obviously contained information about her true identity. This was exactly the kind of professional conduct she hoped to see throughout the base. "That will be helpful, thank you." As they walked down the corridor, Martinez stole several glances at Sarah, clearly trying to reconcile her appearance with whatever information she had seen on her screen. But she maintained her professional composure and said nothing beyond polite small talk about the weather and the base facilities. They arrived at a conference room where Captain Robert Williams, the base's executive officer, was waiting along with several other senior staff members. Williams was a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. When Sarah entered the room, she could see the same confusion on the faces of the assembled officers that she had noticed with the yeoman. They had obviously been expecting someone quite different. "Good morning," Williams said, standing and extending his hand. "You must be Admiral Chun." The slight hesitation in his voice revealed his uncertainty, and Sarah could practically see the mental calculations happening behind his eyes as he tried to process what he was seeing versus what he had expected. "That's correct, Captain Williams," Sarah replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you for arranging this meeting." Williams gestured to the other officers present. "Allow me to introduce the senior staff. This is Commander Patricia Hayes, our operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens, Intelligence, Commander James Russell, Engineering, and Lieutenant Commander Angela Foster, Personnel." Each officer stood to shake Sarah's hand, and she could see varying degrees of surprise, curiosity, and what might have been skepticism in their expressions. They were all professional, but the undercurrent of uncertainty was palpable. "Please have a seat," Williams said, indicating the head of the conference table. "We've prepared a briefing on current base operations, as requested." As the meeting progressed, Sarah listened carefully to each department's presentation. The information was thorough and well-organized, but she began to notice patterns that confirmed some of her earlier observations. Several departments were reporting higher than normal stress levels among personnel, and there seemed to be communication gaps between different units. Commander Hayes presented the operations overview with military precision. We currently have 3,200 personnel assigned to the base, with operational readiness at 92%. However, we have been experiencing some challenges with scheduling conflicts and resource allocation. Sarah made notes as each officer spoke, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of naval operations. She could see the initial uncertainty in their expressions gradually giving way to respect as they realized she clearly knew what she was talking about. What specific steps have been taken to address the scheduling conflicts? Sarah asked. We've implemented a new rotation system, Commander Russell explained, but it's still being refined based on feedback from the department heads. And what has that feedback indicated? Russell exchanged a glance with Hayes before responding. Some concerns about fairness in duty assignments, and questions about whether the new system adequately accounts for the different skill requirements across specialties. Sarah nodded, recognizing these as common challenges in large military installations. Have there been any formal complaints filed? A few, Lieutenant Commander Foster admitted. Nothing serious, but there does seem to be some general dissatisfaction with how the changes were implemented. This confirmed Sarah's suspicion that communication between leadership and lower-ranking personnel might need improvement. The sailors she had encountered outside had expressed similar frustrations, albeit in a less professional manner. What about morale indicators? Sarah asked. Are we tracking any specific metrics beyond the formal complaint process? The question seemed to catch the staff off guard, and Williams cleared his throat before responding. We conduct regular inspections and maintain communication with department heads, but we might benefit from more systematic morale assessment. Sarah made another note. Systematic morale assessment was something she had implemented successfully at her previous assignment, and it had proven invaluable for identifying problems before they became serious issues. As the meeting continued, she began to form a clearer picture of the base's strengths and weaknesses. The senior staff was competent and dedicated, but they seemed to be operating somewhat in isolation from the day-to-day experiences of their personnel. This wasn't uncommon in large organizations, but it was something that needed to be addressed. I'd like to schedule individual meetings with each of you over the next week, Sarah said as the briefing concluded. I want to get a deeper understanding of your specific challenges and hear any suggestions you might have for improving operations. Of course, Admiral, Williams replied. We'll coordinate with your aide to set up those meetings. Actually, I won't be bringing an aide initially, Sarah said. I prefer to handle my own scheduling for the first few weeks while I'm getting familiar with the base. This prompted another round of surprised glances. Most flag officers relied heavily on their support staff, but Sarah had always preferred a more hands-on approach, especially when taking over a new command. I also want to schedule some informal interactions with personnel at all levels, she continued. I'd like to get a sense of how policies and procedures are working from the perspective of the people who implement them daily. Commander Foster nodded approvingly. That's an excellent idea, Admiral. I can arrange some meet and greet sessions with different departments. Thank you, but I was thinking of something more spontaneous, Sarah said. I find that formal meetings sometimes don't provide the most honest feedback. I prefer to just show up in different areas and talk to whoever is available. The concept of an admiral conducting impromptu visits clearly made the senior staff nervous, but Sarah could see that they recognized the value of the approach. Of course, Admiral, Williams said. We'll make sure the department heads know to expect your visits. Actually, let's not announce them, Sarah said with a slight smile. I think we'll get more authentic insights if people aren't preparing for my arrival. After the meeting concluded and the senior staff had departed, Williams lingered behind. Admiral, if you don't mind me asking, he began carefully, you're quite different from what we were expecting. Sarah appreciated his directness. In what way, Captain? Well, frankly, we were told to expect someone young, but he gestured vaguely, clearly struggling to find diplomatic language. But you weren't expecting someone who looks like she could be a college student? Sarah suggested with amusement. Williams looked relieved that she had said it first. Something like that, yes. I hope you don't take offense. It's just that most flag officers are. Older white man. Sarah finished. I'm aware that I don't fit the traditional profile, Captain Williams. I've been dealing with that reality my entire career. How do you find it affects your ability to lead? Williams asked, his curiosity seeming genuine rather than challenging. Sarah considered the question carefully. It means I have to prove myself more often than some of my peers. But it also gives me perspectives that can be valuable. I understand what it's like to be underestimated, which helps me recognize and develop potential in others who might be overlooked. Williams nodded thoughtfully. I imagine that experience shaped your leadership style. It has, Sarah agreed. I believe in leading by example and making decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. Which brings me to something I observed this morning. She went on to describe her encounter with the 5 sailors outside the building, without mentioning names or being overly critical. William's expression grew increasingly concerned as she related their behavior. That's completely inappropriate, he said when she finished. I'll have those sailors identified and disciplined immediately. Actually, Captain, I'd prefer to handle this differently, Sarah said. Rather than punishment, I think this represents a training opportunity. Their behavior suggests some gaps in our professional standards education. Williams looked surprised, but nodded. What did you have in mind? I'd like to address this as part of a broader initiative to reinforce professional conduct standards across the base. Make it about continuous improvement rather than punishment for specific individuals. That's a very thoughtful approach, Admiral. Sarah could see that Williams was reassessing his initial assumptions about her leadership style. Many flag officers would have demanded immediate disciplinary action, but Sarah had learned that effective leadership was often about addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. One more question, if I may, Williams said. When do you plan to make your official assumption of command announcement? Sarah checked her watch. Actually, I was thinking of doing it at the 1100 formation. I understand there's a routine inspection scheduled. Yes, but we could postpone it if you prefer a more formal ceremony. No, I think the routine formation will be perfect. Sometimes the best way to take command is to simply show up and get to work. William smiled for the first time since the meeting began. I think the personnel are going to find you quite different from what they're expecting. I certainly hope so, Captain. Change is usually good, as long as it's implemented thoughtfully. After Williams left, Sarah spent a few minutes alone in the conference room, reviewing her notes and thinking about her first impressions of the base. The senior staff was professional and competent, but she sensed they had been operating in a somewhat insular environment. The disconnect between leadership and lower-ranking personnel was concerning, but not unusual or insurmountable. She thought again about the 5 sailors outside the building, who were probably still assuming she had gotten lost and given up on whatever business had brought her to the base. In about 30 minutes, they would be lined up for the routine formation where she would officially take command. Sarah wasn't looking forward to their embarrassment, but she was looking forward to the opportunity it would provide to establish new expectations for professional conduct. Sometimes the most effective teaching moments came from unexpected circumstances. As she prepared to leave the conference room and begin her first day as the commanding officer of Naval Base Norfolk, Sarah reflected on the challenges ahead. Leading any military installation required balancing authority with approachability, maintaining discipline while fostering innovation, and respecting tradition while implementing necessary changes. But she had faced similar challenges before, and she had learned that authentic leadership was about more than rank or protocol. It was about creating an environment where every person could contribute their best effort while maintaining the highest standards of military excellence. The real test would come in the next few hours, when she stood before the assembled personnel and began the process of earning their respect, not just as their commanding officer, but as their leader. At exactly 1100 hours, the entire base personnel began assembling on the main parade ground for what they believed was a routine weekly formation. The autumn sun cast sharp shadows across the concrete as nearly 3,000 sailors arranged themselves in precise rows according to their units and ranks. Sarah stood in Captain Williams' office, watching through the window as the formation took shape. She had changed into her dress uniform, and the sight of the Admiral's insignia on her collar still felt somewhat surreal, even after all these years of working toward this moment. "They're ready for you, Admiral," Williams announced from behind his desk, where he had been coordinating the final arrangements. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her uniform jacket. "Let's do this." As they walked toward the parade ground, Williams briefed her on the standard formation protocol. "Normally, I would conduct the inspection and make any routine announcements, but I assume you'll want to handle the introduction yourself." "Yes, but let's stick to the normal routine first," Sarah said. "I want to observe how things typically operate before I make any changes." They approached the formation from the side, and Sarah could see the 5 sailors from her morning encounter standing in formation with their respective units. Petty Officer Patterson was in the front row of his unit, looking properly military in his dress uniform, a stark contrast to the casual attitude he had displayed earlier. Williams called the formation to attention, and 3,000 pairs of boots came together with a sound like thunder. Sarah felt the familiar surge of pride that came with witnessing such precision and discipline. Despite the issues she had observed, this was still a highly trained military unit. "Good morning," Williams began, his voice carrying easily across the formation. "We'll begin with a routine inspection, followed by some announcements." Sarah remained slightly behind and to the side as Williams began the inspection process, walking along the front rank and checking uniforms, bearing, and military appearance. She used this time to observe the personnel more closely, noting their level of attention, their military bearing, and their general demeanor. As Williams moved through the inspection, Sarah noticed various reactions among the personnel. Most maintained proper military composure, but she could see some curious glances in her direction as sailors tried to figure out who she was and why she was present. When Williams reached the section where Patterson was standing, Sarah paid particular attention to the exchange. Patterson's uniform was immaculate, and his bearing was everything a military inspector would want to see. It was a reminder that the same person who had been casually disrespectful a few hours earlier was fully capable of military professionalism when the situation required it. "Inspection complete," Williams announced as he returned to the front of the formation. "Now, I have an important announcement to make." The formation remained at attention, but Sarah could sense the heightened attention as personnel prepared to hear whatever news Williams had to share. "It is my honor to introduce you to your new commanding officer," Williams continued, his voice carrying across the silent parade ground. "Please welcome Admiral Sarah Chun." Sarah stepped forward, and a ripple of surprise went through the formation like a wave. She could see heads turning slightly as personnel tried to get a better look at her, and she noticed several faces showing varying degrees of shock, confusion, and curiosity. The reaction from the 5 sailors she had encountered earlier was particularly dramatic. Patterson's eyes widened visibly, and she could see him exchange quick glances with his companions, all of whom looked like they were experiencing the same moment of horrified realization. "Formation," Williams called out, "present arms." The response was immediate and precise, with 3,000 sailors saluting in perfect unison. Sarah returned the salute, then gestured for the formation to return to attention. "Thank you, Captain Williams," she said, stepping forward to address the assembled personnel. Her voice was clear and confident, carrying easily across the parade ground despite her relatively small stature. "Good morning, sailors of Naval Base Norfolk. I am Admiral Sarah Chun, and as of today, I have the honor and privilege of serving as your commanding officer." She paused, letting her words sink in and observing the reactions throughout the formation. She could see that many personnel were still processing the reality of her appearance versus their expectations. "I know that many of you were expecting someone different," she continued with a slight smile. "Perhaps someone older or someone who fits a more traditional image of what an admiral looks like. I understand that because I've been dealing with those same expectations my entire career." A few chuckles rippled through the formation, and Sarah could see some of the tension beginning to ease as personnel realized she was addressing their surprise directly rather than ignoring it. But I want you to know that regardless of how I look or how old I am here for the same reason all of you are here, to serve our country with honor, integrity, and excellence. And I intend to do that by working with each of you to make Naval Base Norfolk the most professional, effective, and cohesive military installation in the fleet. She began walking slowly along the front of the formation as she spoke, making eye contact with individual sailors and ensuring her message was reaching everyone present. Over the past few months, I have studied the reports from this base extensively. I know about your operational successes, your training achievements, and your contributions to our national defense. This is a base with a proud history and a reputation for excellence, and I am honored to be joining that tradition. As she walked, she could see various reactions among the personnel. Some sailors looked interested and engaged, others appeared skeptical but attentive, and a few seemed to be warming up to her direct, no-nonsense approach. However, I also know that no organization is perfect, and there's always room for improvement. During my time here, I will be working to identify areas where we can enhance our operations, improve our communication, and strengthen our unity as a military family. She paused in front of the section where Patterson and his companions were standing. They were maintaining proper military bearing, but she could see the anxiety in their eyes as they recognized her and began to understand the implications of their earlier behavior. I believe strongly in leading by example and in treating every member of this command with the respect and professionalism they deserve, Sarah continued, her gaze lingering briefly on Patterson before moving on. And I expect that same level of respect and professionalism to be shown to everyone who comes onto this base, regardless of their rank, their position, or their appearance. The message was subtle but clear, and she could see understanding dawning on the faces of the 5 sailors who had mocked her earlier. But rather than dwelling on their embarrassment, she continued with her broader message. Excellence in military service is not just about following orders or maintaining equipment or passing inspections, although all of those things are important. Excellence is about how we treat each other, how we represent our service and our country, and how we conduct ourselves both on duty and off-duty. She returned to the center of the formation, her voice taking on a more personal tone. I want to be clear about my expectations. I expect honesty in all communications. I expect professionalism in all interactions. I expect dedication to continuous improvement. And I expect each of you to take responsibility for maintaining the highest standards of military conduct. Sarah paused, scanning the entire formation before continuing. In return, I promise you that I will be accessible, fair, and committed to your success. My door will be open to any sailor who wants to discuss concerns, suggestions, or ideas for improvement. I will make decisions based on facts and evidence, not assumptions or favoritism. And I will work tirelessly to ensure that this base provides you with the leadership, resources, and support you need to excel in your duties. She could see that her words were resonating with many of the personnel, and the initial skepticism she had sensed was beginning to give way to cautious optimism. Over the coming weeks, I will be visiting each department and meeting with personnel at all levels. These won't be formal inspections or evaluation sessions. They will be opportunities for me to learn about your work, understand your challenges, and hear your ideas for how we can improve our operations. The announcement of informal visits prompted some subtle reactions throughout the formation. Sarah could see that the concept made some people nervous, but others appeared intrigued by the idea of direct access to their commanding officer. I want to emphasize that these conversations will be about moving forward, not dwelling on past problems. I'm not interested in finding fault or assigning blame. I'm interested in building on our strengths and addressing any weaknesses as a team. She thought again about the 5 sailors standing in formation who were probably wondering if they were about to face disciplinary action. But Sarah had meant what she said about focusing on moving forward rather than punishment. Change can be challenging, and I understand that my arrival represents a significant change for this base. But I believe that change, when implemented thoughtfully and with clear communication, can make us stronger and more effective. Sarah's voice took on a more inspirational tone as she concluded her remarks. Each of you chose to serve in the United States Navy for your own reasons. Perhaps it was a desire to serve your country, or to develop your skills, or to be part of something larger than yourself. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know that your service matters, your contribution is valued, and your potential for growth and advancement is unlimited. She paused one final time, making eye contact with personnel throughout the formation. Together, we will continue the proud tradition of Naval Base Norfolk while building an even stronger foundation for future success. Thank you for your attention, your service, and your commitment to excellence. The formation remained at attention as Sarah stepped back, and Williams moved forward to dismiss the personnel. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. Chief Petty Officer Maria Gonzalez, a 20-year veteran standing in the front rank, spoke up. "Admiral, permission to speak?" Sarah looked at her with interest. "Permission granted, Chief." "Ma'am, on behalf of the enlisted personnel of Naval Base Norfolk, welcome aboard. We look forward to working with you." The sentiment appeared to be genuine, and Sarah could see nods of agreement throughout the formation. "Thank you, Chief Gonzalez. I look forward to working with all of you as well." Williams then dismissed the formation, and the personnel began to disperse in an orderly fashion. But Sarah noticed that many sailors lingered, talking in small groups and stealing glances in her direction. She could see that her introduction had generated significant interest and discussion. As the crowd began to thin, Sarah found herself approached by several senior enlisted personnel who wanted to introduce themselves. Each interaction was professional and respectful, but she could also sense a cautious optimism about her leadership approach. Among the last to leave were the 5 sailors from her morning encounter. They approached slowly, clearly uncertain about whether they should address what had happened earlier. Patterson stepped forward as their spokesperson, his earlier cockiness replaced by obvious nervousness. "Admiral, that is, I wanted to—" he began, clearly struggling to find the right words. Sarah regarded him calmly, neither hostile nor overly friendly. "Yes, Seaman Patterson." The use of his name confirmed that she knew exactly who he was and what had transpired earlier, which made him even more uncomfortable. "We wanted to apologize for this morning, ma'am. We didn't know who you were, and we were completely out of line." Sarah considered her response carefully. This was an important teaching moment, not just for these 5 sailors, but for anyone else who might be watching the interaction. "Seaman Patterson, can I ask you a question?" "Yes, ma'am. If you had known who I was this morning, would you have behaved differently?" Patterson looked confused by the question. "Of course, ma'am. And that's exactly the problem," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm, but carrying clear authority. "Professional conduct and respect for others shouldn't depend on someone's rank or position. It should be the standard way we treat everyone, all the time." The 5 sailors exchanged glances, beginning to understand the deeper lesson she was teaching. "You're absolutely right, ma'am," Patterson replied, his voice showing genuine recognition of his error. "This morning, you made assumptions about who I was based on my appearance, and you let those assumptions guide your behavior. That kind of thinking can be dangerous in a military environment, where quick judgments can have serious consequences." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But rather than focusing on punishment, I want this to be a learning experience. I want all of you to think about how you approach interactions with others, whether they're fellow sailors, civilians, or visitors to our base. Everyone deserves to be treated with basic respect and professionalism." The group nodded solemnly, clearly taking her message to heart. "Thank you for your apology," Sarah concluded. "And thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I hope you'll remember this lesson and share it with others." As the 5 sailors departed, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. Her first day as Admiral of Naval Base Norfolk had certainly been eventful, but she felt optimistic about the foundation she was beginning to build for her command. In the days following Sarah's introduction to the base, word of the morning encounter spread throughout Naval Base Norfolk like wildfire. The story evolved and grew with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. The new admiral was not what anyone had expected, and first impressions could be dangerously misleading. Sarah spent her first week conducting the informal visits she had promised during her introduction speech. Unlike traditional command inspections, these were unannounced appearances in various departments, workshops, and operational areas where she could observe normal work routines and engage in casual conversations with personnel at all levels. Her first stop was the engine maintenance facility, where she found Chief Petty Officer Martinez training a group of junior sailors on turbine repair procedures. The sight of an admiral walking into their workspace caused an immediate stir, but Sarah quickly put everyone at ease. "Please, continue with what you were doing," she said, waving away their attempts to stop work and come to attention. "I'm just here to learn about your operations." Chief Martinez, a 25-year veteran with grease-stained hands and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working with machinery, regarded her with cautious respect. "What would you like to know, Admiral?" "Everything," Sarah replied with a smile. "Pretend I'm a new sailor who needs to understand how this department contributes to the base's overall mission." Over the next hour, Sarah listened as Martinez explained the intricacies of maintaining the various engines and mechanical systems that kept the base operational. She asked detailed questions that demonstrated her genuine interest and technical understanding, gradually winning over the skeptical sailors who had initially viewed her visit as an unwelcome interruption. "How often do you encounter parts availability issues?" Sarah asked, noting some improvised repairs she had observed. "More often than we'd like, ma'am," Martinez admitted. "Sometimes we have to get creative to keep equipment running while we wait for proper replacement parts." "What's the typical delay for critical components?" "Can be anywhere from a week to 2 months, depending on what it is and where it has to come from." Sarah made notes in the small notebook she carried, asking follow-up questions about supply chain management and maintenance scheduling. By the time she left, the entire department was talking about how different she was from previous flag officers who had visited their facility. Her next stop was the communications center, where she found Petty Officer Second Class Kim working the overnight shift. Kim was initially nervous about explaining her work to an admiral, but Sarah's patient questions and obvious technical knowledge soon put her at ease. "The biggest challenge we face is coordinating with different time zones when we're supporting operations overseas," Kim explained, gesturing to the complex array of monitoring equipment that filled the room. "How do you manage the workload when you're dealing with multiple simultaneous communications requirements?" Sarah asked. "Honestly, ma'am, it can get pretty intense. Sometimes we're handling routine administrative traffic while also supporting emergency communications, and the priorities aren't always clear." Sarah spent nearly 2 hours in the communications center, learning about the challenges of managing information flow in a complex military environment. She took detailed notes about staffing levels, equipment capabilities, and the procedures for handling different types of communications traffic. As she visited more departments, a pattern began to emerge. The personnel were competent and dedicated, but many were dealing with resource constraints, unclear priorities, or communication gaps that prevented them from performing at their full potential. These were exactly the kinds of issues that could be addressed through better coordination and leadership support. Her visit to the personnel office provided particularly valuable insights. Lieutenant Commander Foster was working late, reviewing promotion paperwork and performance evaluations. "Admiral, I wasn't expecting you," Foster said, looking up from a stack of files covering her desk. "That's the idea," Sarah replied. "I want to see how things really operate, not how they look when everyone's preparing for an inspection." Foster gestured to the paperwork surrounding her. "Well, this is how it really looks. We're behind on processing several personnel actions because we're short-staffed and dealing with some complex cases that require extra research and coordination. Sarah pulled up a chair and spent the next hour learning about the challenges of managing personnel issues for a base with over 3,000 sailors. Foster explained the difficulties of balancing training requirements, operational needs, and personal circumstances while maintaining fair and consistent policies. What would help most in improving your department's effectiveness? Sarah asked. Better integration with other departments. Foster replied, without hesitation. Sometimes we're making personnel decisions without full information about operational requirements, or we're implementing policies that create unintended conflicts with other areas. This reinforced Sarah's growing understanding that many of the base's challenges stemmed from communication and coordination issues rather than individual department failures. By the end of her first week, Sarah had visited nearly every major department on the base. She had talked with sailors from every rank and specialty, from junior personnel just out of basic training to senior enlisted leaders with decades of experience. The picture that emerged was of a competent organization with significant unrealized potential. On Friday afternoon, she called a meeting with her senior staff to discuss her initial observations and begin planning for improvements. Based on my visits this week, I want to share some thoughts about our current operations and potential areas for improvement, she began, addressing the assembled department heads. Captain Williams and the other senior officers listened attentively as Sarah outlined her findings. She was careful to emphasize positive observations while also addressing the challenges she had identified. First, I want to acknowledge the high level of professionalism and competence I've observed throughout the base. Our personnel are clearly skilled and dedicated, and they take pride in their work. This brought visible relief to several department heads who had been concerned about what she might have discovered during her unannounced visits. However, I've also identified some areas where we can improve our effectiveness through better coordination and communication. Sarah spent the next hour outlining specific issues she had observed: supply chain delays affecting maintenance operations, unclear priority procedures in the communications center, staffing shortages in administrative areas, and, most importantly, a lack of integrated planning across departments. Many of these challenges are interconnected, she explained. For example, maintenance delays affect operational readiness, which impacts training schedules, which creates personnel management issues. We need to develop better mechanisms for coordinating our planning and response to these kinds of cascading effects. Commander Hayes raised her hand. Admiral, what kind of coordination mechanisms are you thinking about? I want to establish weekly cross-departmental planning meetings where each department can brief the others on upcoming challenges, resource needs, and potential impacts on base operations. This will help us anticipate problems and develop coordinated solutions rather than reacting to crises after they develop. The concept prompted immediate discussion among the senior staff, with several officers expressing enthusiasm for better interdepartmental coordination. I also want to implement a systematic feedback mechanism for personnel at all levels to communicate concerns, suggestions, and ideas directly to leadership, Sarah continued. Not through the formal complaint process, but through regular opportunities for upward communication. Lieutenant Commander Stevens looked intrigued. What kind of feedback mechanism? Monthly forums where personnel can meet with senior staff in a casual setting to discuss operational issues. No formal presentations or prepared remarks, just open discussion about what's working well and what could be improved. Foster nodded approvingly. That could help us identify personnel issues before they become serious problems. Sarah was pleased to see the positive response from her staff. These are just initial ideas based on my first week of observations. I want to continue gathering input from personnel throughout the base before we implement any major changes. As the meeting concluded, Williams approached her privately. Admiral, I have to say, your approach is quite different from what we're used to, but the response from personnel has been overwhelmingly positive. What kind of response have you been hearing? People are talking about feeling heard and valued. The fact that you're taking time to visit their workplaces and ask about their challenges has made a real impression. Sarah was gratified to hear this, but She also knew that initial enthusiasm would need to be backed up by concrete improvements to maintain credibility. That's encouraging, but now comes the hard part: actually implementing changes that make a meaningful difference in her daily work. Over the weekend, Sarah reviewed all the notes she had taken during her department visits, looking for patterns and priorities. She was beginning to see how the various pieces of the base's operations fit together, and where strategic improvements could have the greatest impact. The most significant insight was that many problems were symptomatic of a deeper issue. The base had been operating as a collection of separate departments rather than as an integrated organization. Each department was competent within its own area, but there were gaps in coordination that created inefficiencies and missed opportunities. On Monday morning, she implemented her first concrete change: a daily morning briefing where representatives from each major department would spend 15 minutes sharing their priorities, challenges, and resource needs for the day. It was a simple change, but one that would begin building the communication bridges that had been missing. The morning briefing was held in the main conference room at 0700 hours, with each department sending a representative to provide a brief status update. Sarah attended the first session to demonstrate its importance and to model the kind of information sharing she wanted to see. "Good morning," she began, addressing the assembled department representatives. "This briefing is designed to help us coordinate our daily activities and identify opportunities for mutual support. Each department will have 3 minutes to brief their priorities, any challenges they're facing, and any assistance they might need from other departments." The first session was somewhat tentative, with representatives sticking to basic operational updates. But Sarah could see the potential for improved coordination as departments learned about activities and challenges in other areas that might affect their own work. Chief Martinez from the maintenance department mentioned that they would be conducting engine repairs that might require temporary power restrictions in certain areas of the base. The facilities management representative immediately coordinated to ensure that scheduled maintenance in those areas could be rescheduled to avoid conflicts. The communications center reported that they would be supporting an overseas training exercise that might require additional coordination with the personnel office for duty assignments. Foster's representative made note to follow up on any scheduling conflicts. These kinds of real-time coordination opportunities have been missed in the past, leading to inefficiencies and occasional operational conflicts. After the briefing, Sarah spent some time reflecting on the progress she had made in her first week as Admiral. The encounter with the 5 sailors outside the building seemed like a distant memory, but it had served as a valuable introduction to the kinds of challenges she would face in transforming the base's culture and operations. The incident had highlighted the importance of first impressions, but more importantly, it had demonstrated how assumptions and prejudices could interfere with effective military operations. By addressing it as a teaching opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter, she had begun to establish the kind of leadership approach she wanted to model throughout the base. As she prepared for her second week of command, Sarah felt optimistic about the changes she was beginning to implement. The personnel were responding positively to her hands-on leadership style, and the senior staff was embracing the coordination improvements she had proposed. But she also knew that real organizational change took time and sustained effort. The initial enthusiasm would need to be maintained through consistent follow-through and continuous improvement. The foundation she was building would need to be strong enough to support the larger changes she envisioned for Naval Base Norfolk. The transformation had begun, but the real work was just starting. 3 months after Admiral Sarah Chen's arrival at Naval Base Norfolk, the transformation was evident to anyone who had known the base before her command. The changes weren't flashy or dramatic, but they were deep and systemic, affecting how the entire organization operated and how personnel interacted with each other. The morning briefings had evolved into a sophisticated coordination mechanism that prevented dozens of small problems from becoming larger issues. Department representatives now came prepared not just to report their own status, but to offer assistance to other departments and to identify opportunities for collaborative solutions to shared challenges. On this particular Tuesday morning, the briefing demonstrated the kind of integrated thinking that had become routine under Sarah's leadership. Maintenance reports that the backup generator for Building 7 will be offline for scheduled repairs from 1,400 to 1,800 hours today, announced Chief Martinez's representative. Immediately, the Communications Center representative spoke up. We have a scheduled software update for the main server array during that same time window. We can coordinate with facilities to run that update from the backup facility to avoid any power interruption issues. The Personnel Office representative added, we were planning to conduct interviews for the new administrative positions in Building 7 this afternoon. We can relocate those to Building 3 to avoid any disruption. These kinds of proactive coordination had become second nature, preventing the conflicts and inefficiencies that had previously plagued base operations. But, more importantly, they reflected a fundamental change in how personnel thought about their work, not as isolated tasks within separate departments, but as interconnected elements of a larger mission. After the briefing, Sarah made her way to the Communications Center for her weekly informal visit. These visits had become a regular part of her routine, allowing her to maintain direct contact with personnel at all levels while monitoring the implementation of her various improvement initiatives. She found Petty Officer Kim training 2 junior sailors on the new emergency communication protocols that had been developed based on feedback from her first-week visits. "Good morning, Petty Officer Kim," Sarah said, noting how much more confident the young sailor appeared compared to their first meeting 3 months earlier. "Good morning, Admiral," Kim replied, her nervousness replaced by the comfortable professionalism that had developed through regular interaction. "We were just going over the new priority classification system." Sarah listened as Kim explained the improved procedures to the junior sailors, noting how she seamlessly integrated technical requirements with practical examples drawn from recent operational experiences. The confidence and competence she displayed were representative of the professional development that had occurred throughout the base under Sarah's leadership approach. "What feedback have you received from other stations about the new protocols?" Sarah asked. "Very positive, ma'am. The clearer priority guidelines have eliminated most of the confusion we used to have during complex operations, and the coordination procedures have improved our response time for emergency situations." This was exactly the kind of improvement Sarah had hoped to achieve, not just fixing immediate problems, but creating systems that enhance performance across all operations. As she continued her visit, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought Naval Base Norfolk to this point. The initial skepticism and uncertainty had given way to a culture of continuous improvement and mutual support. Personnel at all levels had embraced the opportunity to contribute their ideas and expertise to enhancing base operations. The monthly forums she had implemented had become popular venues for discussing operational challenges and developing innovative solutions. Rather than just complaining about problems, personnel were taking ownership of identifying and implementing improvements. Last month's forum had generated a particularly valuable discussion about training efficiency. Several junior sailors had suggested modifications to the standard training schedule that would reduce conflicts with operational requirements while actually improving learning outcomes. The suggestions have been thoroughly evaluated, tested, and ultimately implemented, saving both time and resources while enhancing training effectiveness. Sarah's next stop was the maintenance facility, where she found Chief Martinez working with a team of sailors on a complex engine overhaul. The organized efficiency of the operation was a stark contrast to the improvised repairs she had observed during her first visit. "Admiral," Martinez called out as she approached, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Perfect timing. We just finished installing the new diagnostic equipment that came in ahead of schedule." The phrase "ahead of schedule" would have been unusual 3 months earlier, but the improved supply chain coordination had significantly reduced the parts delays that had previously plagued maintenance operations. "How has the new equipment affected your repair capabilities?" Sarah asked, examining the sophisticated diagnostic tools that had been installed. We can now identify problems much faster and more accurately, Martinez explained enthusiastically. What used to take a full day of troubleshooting can often be diagnosed in less than an hour. It's allowing us to complete repairs faster and with greater confidence in the results. Sarah noted the pride in his voice as he described the improvements in his department's capabilities. This was another sign of the cultural transformation that had occurred. Personnel were no longer just doing their jobs. They were actively working to excel in their specialties. More importantly, Martinez continued, the faster diagnosis means we can often complete repairs during scheduled maintenance windows instead of having equipment offline for extended periods. It's had a significant impact on operational readiness. This was precisely the kind of systemic improvement Sarah had envisioned when she first arrived at the base. By addressing coordination and communication issues, they have been able to implement equipment and procedure upgrades that enhance performance across multiple departments. As she prepared to leave the maintenance facility, Sarah encountered Seaman Patterson, one of the 5 sailors from her first morning encounter. The transformation in his demeanor and bearing was remarkable. "Good morning, Admiral," he said, coming to attention with obvious respect and professionalism. "Good morning, Seaman Patterson. How are you finding your new assignment?" Patterson had requested and been approved for transfer to the maintenance department, where his mechanical aptitude had proven valuable. "Very well, ma'am. Chief Martinez has been an excellent mentor, and I'm learning a lot about systems integration and repair procedures." Sarah could see that he had genuinely embraced the opportunities for professional development that were now available throughout the base. "I also wanted to thank you again for how you handled our situation. When you first arrived," Patterson continued, his voice showing genuine gratitude. "The way you turned it into a learning experience instead of just punishment has stayed with me. I've tried to apply that same approach when I'm working with junior sailors." This was one of the most gratifying aspects of Sarah's leadership approach, not just changing immediate behaviors, but inspiring personnel to become better leaders themselves. "I'm glad to hear that, Seaman Patterson. Leadership development is one of our most important responsibilities." After completing her rounds, Sarah returned to her office to review the quarterly performance reports that had just arrived from each department. The statistics told a remarkable story of improvement across every measurable aspect of base operations. Operational readiness had increased from 92% to 98%, largely due to the improved maintenance coordination and faster repair times. Personnel satisfaction surveys showed significant increases in job satisfaction, professional development opportunities, and confidence in leadership. Supply chain efficiency had improved by 35% through better coordination and planning. But perhaps most importantly, the base had achieved these improvements while actually reducing overall operating costs. The efficiency gains from better coordination had eliminated waste and duplication, allowing them to accomplish more with existing resources. Captain Williams knocked on her door and entered with a smile that had become much more common over the past 3 months. "Admiral, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. "Good news, I hope." "Very good. The Pentagon has selected Naval Base Norfolk for the Admiral Morrison Excellence in Operations Award, based on our performance improvements over the past quarter." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but immediately thought about all the personnel who had contributed to making this recognition possible. "That's wonderful news, Captain. When will the award be presented?" "Next month, at the annual Naval Operations Conference. They specifically requested that you present our improvement initiatives as a case study for other installations." Sarah was honored by the recognition, but she was even more pleased by the opportunity to share their approach with other commands that might benefit from similar improvements. "I'll want to include representatives from each department in the presentation," she said. "This success belongs to everyone who contributed ideas and effort to improving our operations." Williams nodded approvingly. "I expected you'd want to do it that way. I'll coordinate with the department heads to select appropriate representatives." As Williams left to begin coordinating the award presentation, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The morning encounter with 5 skeptical sailors had been just the beginning of a comprehensive transformation that had affected every aspect of base operations. But the most significant change hadn't been in procedures or equipment or organizational charts. The most significant change had been in the culture, from a collection of separate departments focused on their individual responsibilities to an integrated organization committed to collective excellence. Personnel at all levels had embraced the opportunity to contribute their expertise and ideas to continuous improvement. They had learned to see their work not just as individual tasks, but as essential elements of a larger mission that required coordination, cooperation, and mutual support. The transformation had required consistent leadership, clear communication, and genuine respect for the knowledge and capabilities of personnel at every level. But most importantly, it had required the willingness to see beyond first impressions and assumptions to recognize the potential that existed within the organization. As Sarah prepared to leave her office for the day, she encountered Yeoman Martinez at the reception desk. "Admiral, there's a group of new personnel reporting for duty tomorrow morning," Martinez informed her. "Would you like me to schedule them for the standard orientation briefing?" Sarah considered this for a moment. The standard orientation briefing was thorough and professional, but it didn't really capture the spirit of continuous improvement and collaborative excellence that had become the hallmark of Naval Base Norfolk. "Actually, let's do something different," Sarah said. "Let's arrange for them to spend their first day rotating through different departments, talking with the personnel who actually do the work. I want them to understand from the beginning that this is an organization where everyone's contribution matters and everyone's voice is heard." Martinez smiled and made a note to coordinate the new approach with the department heads. As Sarah walked across the base toward the parking lot, she reflected on how much had changed since that first morning 3 months ago. The personnel she encountered now showed the confident professionalism of a unit that took pride in their work and believed in their leadership. The 5 sailors who had mocked the new girl had become some of her strongest supporters, not because she had demanded their respect through her rank, but because she had earned it through her actions and her genuine commitment to their success. The lesson of that first morning had spread throughout the base. Appearances can be deceiving, assumptions can be dangerous, and true leadership is measured not by the authority to command, but by the ability to inspire others to achieve excellence. Naval Base Norfolk had become a model of military efficiency and professionalism, but more importantly, it had become a place where every sailor could contribute their best effort while knowing that their service was valued and their potential recognized. As Sarah drove away from the base, she felt satisfied with the progress they had made, but she also knew that the work of continuous improvement never ended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to build on the foundation they had established. The transformation of Naval Base Norfolk would continue, guided by the principles of respect, collaboration, and excellence that had turned a moment of embarrassment into a lasting lesson about the true meaning of leadership. And somewhere on the base, new sailors will be learning that in the United States Navy, everyone deserves respect, everyone has potential, and everyone can contribute to something greater than themselves.